I should begin, I think, with a quiet evening in the Shire and the sound of a hand knocking on a round green door. My name is Balin, son of Fundin, long a wanderer under strange skies. I have seen halls lit by gold and caverns lit by fire, and I have walked through battlefields when all songs were silent. Yet, when the young ones ask how our adventure began, my memory does not go first to dragons or to war. It returns instead to Bag End, to the smell of supper in a tidy hobbit hole, and to a host who never meant to become a hero. The night stays with me because it reminds me that the largest stories often enter our lives as quietly as guests at a little front gate. We did not descend upon Bilbo Baggins all at once. Gandalf arrived earlier, as was his habit, leaving only a mark on the door and a promise that visitors would follow. By the time my own feet touched the path, the light was slanting low over the hills, and the windows of Bag End were glowing. The soft grass and white flowers underfoot made it hard to remember that far away lay a dark and empty mountain that had once been our home. I knocked. The sound seemed very small in that peaceful evening, yet I have come to believe that the world has turned more than once on such small sounds. After a moment, the door opened, and there he stood, Bilbo Baggins, napkin still in hand, waistcoat neatly buttoned, eyes wide with the polite confusion of a gentle hobbit who finds an armed stranger on his step. There was nothing about him to suggest deep tunnels or perilous roads. He looked like a creature shaped entirely for armchairs, gardens, and second breakfasts. I bowed and gave my name. For a heartbeat, his mouth moved without words, as if the word dwarf belonged to stories rather than to his front garden. Then the habits of hospitality won. He stepped aside and invited me in. I have always believed that this was his first brave act, though he would not have named it so. To welcome the unknown across one's threshold is a quiet courage that goes unsung in most ballads. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and pipe smoke. It made me suddenly aware of the dust on my cloak and the weariness in my bones. Bilbo fussed with cups and plates, murmuring apologies where none were needed, glancing toward the pantry with a look halfway between dread and determination. One by one the others arrived, each knock bringing more boots, more beards, more low voices speaking in the tongue of our people. Soon the little house was full of us. Thorin came last, as was fitting. When he stepped into that warm kitchen with its shining dishes and carefully stacked pans, the room itself seemed to contract around him. The fire picked out the lines of his face and the steel at his side. I watched Bilbo's expression shift from alarm to something like awe. We ate and we talked, and at last we sang. You may have heard that song in one form or another, the one where we told of the halls of Erebor, of carven pillars and flowing rivers of stone, of the hoard beneath the mountain, and of the fire that came upon it. Our voices filled the snug rooms of Bag End with echoes that did not belong to the Shire at all. I watched Bilbo as we sang. At first he shifted in his chair, ill at ease, as if such heavy notes did not quite fit among his teacups. Then a change came over him. His eyes grew distant, as though he were seeing something beyond the walls, something vast and terrible and beautiful that he could not yet name. Most folk of the Shire had heard of our tragedy only as a distant tale, soon forgotten once the evening paper was folded away. For us, it was the wound at the centre of our lives. As the verses rolled out, I felt again the heat of that day long past, and smelled again the smoke on the wind. Yet over those memories lay the sight of the Hobbit by the hearth, sitting very still, with a look that said he had just discovered that the world stretched much farther than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. There are times when another person's sorrow opens a hidden door inside us. We may be busy with the small worries of ordinary days, and then a song or a story reaches us. I think that evening was such a moment for Bilbo. His larder was full, his chair was comfortable, his life was respectable and well arranged, yet something in our song told him that there were rooms within him he had never visited. When the maps were spread, and the talk turned to roots, provisions, and a fair share of the expected treasure, he fluttered and protested as any sensible hobbit would. He had no training, he said. He was not a burglar, he said. His feet were meant for garden paths, not for stony passes or dark forests. In truth, we shared his doubts. Many of us saw in him only a small and nervous host who happened to be standing where Gandalf needed him to stand. Even so, there were moments when I caught another glimpse of him, a tilt of the head when Thorin spoke of reclaiming our home, a quick, almost guilty spark in his eyes when Gandalf mentioned the word adventure. It was as if two Bilbos sat in that cheerful room. One clung tightly to his supper and his schedule. The other leaned forward, listening to something only he could hear. That night in Bag End, the ink was not yet on the contract, and the candles still burned low and steady. Outside, crickets sang in the soft shire grass. Inside, a circle of exiled dwarves spoke of rivers and mountains, while a hobbit quietly struggled with his own heart. From the doorway, it might have looked like nothing more than friendly conversation over supper. Yet something was shifting, both in that little house and in the wide world beyond. But we still wonder whether, even before his hand reached for the pen, some deep part of Bilbo Baggins had already stepped out of his front door, answering a call he had never meant to hear. The supper at Bag End is often remembered as a jumble of beards, dishes, and confusion. When I think of it now, I see a small dining room trying to hold more history than its walls were built for. I was only an old dwarf with a walking stick and an appetite. Yet that evening I felt the weight of our wandering years pushing through that round green door. Bilbo moved like a man in a dream as more of us arrived. His politeness fought with his alarm in every gesture. When Bomber at last squeezed through the doorway and nearly brought the coat rack down, our host stared as if the house itself might crack. Still, he offered chairs, filled cups, apologized when pots rattled under the strain. Flustered though he was, he kept his courtesy like a shield. Around the table our voices rose and fell. We spoke of ponies and provisions, and we spoke of the mountain and the dragon that had driven us out. Thorin sat at the head, grave and silent, as if the plain wooden chair beneath him were already a throne. When he finally spoke, the room itself seemed to lean towards him. Gandalf brought out the map then. The parchment caught the firelight as he spread it over Bilbo's polished table. There was the line of the lonely mountain, sharp and jagged. There was the mark of a secret door, no more than a tiny symbol, yet for us it was a promise of return. Bilbo peered at it with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, as though some wild thing had been set loose among his best dishes. Thorin's voice deepened as he spoke of our lost home. He told of the days when the forges sang without rest, and light shone on honest gold. Then his tone darkened as he named the fire from the sky, the rush of wings, the thunder that tore through our halls. He did not dwell on detail. In the short pauses between his words, I heard again the shouts of that day and felt the ground tremble under my boots. Bilbo listened with his hands tightly clasped in his lap. From where I sat, I could see the small pulse beating at his throat. The tale of the dragon was not new to him. News of such a calamity had once reached even these gentle hills. Yet that night the story had weight. It was no longer a rumour from far-off lands. It was sitting at his own table, asking for salt and passing the bread. Later, when the dishes were stacked as high as his patience would allow and the candles had burned low, we sang. The song rose slowly, like smoke from a freshly lit fire. As the verses unfolded, grief and longing seemed to take visible form in the room. I do not know what the words meant to Bilbo, who had never lived under stone for more than a short walk through a tunnel. For us, they were more than lament. They were a vow we had waited too long to keep. There was a moment during that song when I looked toward our host and saw tears glint in his eyes. He brushed them away at once, embarrassed, though there was no cause for shame. Sometimes another person's sorrow reaches across the table and touches a hidden place within us. That night, I think, something like that stirred in Bilbo Baggins. When the last note faded, silence settled over us, broken only by the low crackle of the hearth. Then came the talk that would decide the course of his life and ours. Thorin spoke first calmly of shares and responsibilities. He spoke of the need for a burglar, for someone small and nimble who could slip unseen where warriors could not go. Gandalf nodded as if the choice were obvious, then laid his hand on Bilbo's shoulder and named him for the task. Our host almost dropped his cup. He stammered, protested, clutched at every reason why such a role was absurd. No skills, no training, no taste for danger. His denial tumbled out faster than his thoughts could follow. Some of us hid smiles in our beards. Others frowned, unwilling to stake our hope on a stranger whose chief talent so far seemed to be providing supper. Yet I watched him more closely. Beneath the flurry of refusal, something else flickered in his gaze. It was very small, that light, no more than a spark. But I had seen its like before, in quiet people when life offers them a choice they never looked for. It is the look of someone arguing with a part of himself that wants more than he dares to admit. The contract came out next. It was long and full of alarming possibilities, all set down in neat lines. Loss, injury, expenses, an unsteady list of ways in which things might go wrong. Bilbo read and reread, his brows drawing closer with each clause. Yet he did not tear the paper up. He set it down and paced. He picked it up again. The struggle was not with the ink. It was with the life he had built and the quiet whisper that asked whether it was truly enough. At last, the night grew too late, even for further arguments. Beds were found, cloaks were used as pillows, and Bag End settled into uneasy slumber. I lay awake longer than most, listening to the unfamiliar chorus of dwarven snores mingling with the soft creaks of a hobbit house, unused to such guests. From where I rested I could just see the edge of the table where the contract lay waiting in the dim light. That was where the great adventure balanced, not yet begun and not entirely refused. Not on a mountain top, not in the shadow of a dragon, but on a simple table in a tidy room, in the small distance between a pen and a blank space. Every life holds such moments, though we rarely recognize them for what they are. Often they come as a restless night and a decision that refuses to leave us in peace. But we still wonder whether, even before his hand finally reached for the pen, some deep part of Bilbo Baggins had already stepped beyond his front gate, answering the quiet call that had begun to rise beneath the familiar comforts of his well-ordered life. We left Bag End in a rush that morning, as many journeys begin, not with ceremony but with confusion. Dawn in the Shire can be so gentle that it almost persuades you to stay in bed. Mist lay low over the fields, and the first birds were only just testing their voices when we gathered our ponies and checked our packs. Thorin stood apart, already wrapped in his own thoughts, while most of us moved with the easy habit of wanderers. Only Bilbo Baggins was missing. Gandalf, of course, had arranged matters so that our host would have very little time to think himself out of his choice. When Bilbo came running down the lane, hair askew, waistcoat unbuttoned, waving a handkerchief and protesting that he had forgotten almost everything he might need, we could not help a few quiet laughs. He looked less like a burglar and more like a clerk who had taken the wrong turn out of his front door. Yet there was a stubborn set to his mouth that told me the hardest part of his decision had already been made. We rode out together, leaving the snug circle of Bag End behind. At first, the road wound gently through the green hills, past hedges trimmed with loving care and fields where smoke rose from hidden kitchens. Hobbits in the distance paused at their work to stare at us, shading their eyes, puzzled by this sudden string of armed strangers with one bewildered neighbour in their midst. Bilbo lifted his hand to some of them, as if to assure both them and himself that he would be back before long. There is a moment when every road dips, and the place you have always called home disappears from view. I watched Bilbo as that moment came. He twisted in his saddle for a last look at the round green door that had framed his life. When it was gone, his shoulders sagged for a heartbeat, then straightened. I have seen seasoned warriors falter more at that loss of familiar sight than at any roar of an enemy. To walk into danger is hard. To walk away from safety can be harder. For us dwarves, the Shire was a pleasant stretch of land, but not our own. Home lay far behind in memory or far ahead in hope, not under our feet. As the miles passed, my thoughts turned inward. I had agreed to follow Thorin partly out of duty. He was the heir of Durin, and our scattered people needed more than wandering lives and hired work in foreign halls. Yet duty alone would not have been enough. Somewhere within me there still burned the image of great pillars of stone, of hammer song in bright forges, of my father's hand on my shoulder as he spoke of halls that would outlast any storm. Exile teaches you to live on scraps of belonging. The promise of a true return is a fire that never quite goes out. The road itself began kindly enough. The weather held. The ponies were steady. We shared food and light talk, while the fields slowly gave way to wilder ground. Bilbo complained a little of saddle sores and missing meals at proper hours. He worried aloud about having left without enough pocket handkerchiefs. At first, his fussing grated on some of the company, who had long learned to endure discomfort without remark. Yet there was something almost comforting in his small concerns. They were the worries of an ordinary person, and they reminded us that even a great quest is built out of days that must be lived one by one. If you have ever taken your first journey far from home, you may remember a similar mixture of excitement and irritation. The bag is never packed quite right. The bed away from home never feels entirely your own. You find yourself missing the sound of a familiar gate or the way morning light falls through a particular window. Bilbo, who had never planned to go farther than his own cosy lanes, now found the sky suddenly very large above his head. At night we made camp under hedges or in hollow places by the road. Fires were kept low, more for comfort than for defence in those early days. The Shire lay not far behind us, and its peace lent a soft echo even to the wind. Bilbo sat close to the flames, shoulders hunched, eyes flicking toward the shadows beyond the circle of light. He tried to smoke his pipe as if to prove that everything was perfectly ordinary, but his glances told another truth. I often took the first watch, staff in hand, listening to the breathing of my companions as they slept. On one such night, Bilbo crept over, wrapped in his blanket, and sat beside me. He asked a question or two about where we might be on the map, but soon he fell silent. His gaze lifted to the stars, clearer and more numerous than they ever appeared through his round windows. After a while, he murmured that he had not realized how loud the quiet could be, away from the hum of neighborly life. I understood that. There is a kind of silence you find only on the road, when there is nothing between you and the wide world. It can be frightening at first. Then, if you let it, that silence begins to make room for thoughts you have always pushed aside. I did not say so aloud, but I guessed that Bilbo was beginning to meet parts of himself he had never needed to know. The days grew longer, the landscape rougher. Hedges gave way to scattered trees, then to stretches of heath and rock. The neat boundaries of Hobbit farms faded behind us. Thorin walked more often than he rode, measuring distances with the steady pace of one who holds a picture in his mind and moves toward it without swerving. When we spoke together, it was of routes, of rivers to ford and hills to cross. Yet under every practical word lay a question none of us voiced directly. Were we truly equal to what lay ahead, or were we chasing a dream too long deferred? Rain came at last, as it always does. Our cloaks grew heavy, our packs heavier. Bilbo sneezed, and his mood darkened with the clouds. He missed dry socks, proper breakfasts, and a roof that did not drip. I have heard younger folk laugh at such complaints, but they forget how quickly hardship piles up when you are unused to it. A stone in your boot, a damp blanket, a missed meal. Small things, yet together they can wear down even the best intentions. Many listeners know that beyond this stretch of road lay darker trials. Trolls and goblins, mountains and forests, riddles and rings. All of that was still ahead of us then, wrapped in the future like storms on a distant horizon. What we faced now was simpler and, in its own way, just as important. It was the slow work of leaving one life behind and not yet having another to stand on. Sometimes, when the day tired us more than danger ever would, Gandalf would ride ahead alone for a time. He would return with news of the way, or with an armful of gathered herbs, saying little of what his sharp eyes had seen. I trusted him, as did Thorin in his own guarded fashion, yet I often felt that we were moving within a story whose deeper lines only he could read. That can be unsettling, to know that someone else has a clearer view of the path while you stumble from stone to stone. To watch Bilbo in those early days was to witness both stubbornness and fragile courage. He grumbled, yes, and he longed aloud for his kettle and his larder. But he did not turn back. Each complaint was followed by another step forward. It is easy to praise those who stride gladly into peril. Harder, but perhaps fairer, is to honour the ones who go on even while wishing they were at home. But we still wonder whether the true beginning of our quest was not the signing of a contract in Bag End, but this patient stretch of road where a hobbit who loved armchairs kept lifting his foot again and again toward a future he could neither see nor fully trust. We had been out long enough for the edge of the journey to dull into habit, when the land began to turn against us. The fields and tidy lanes of the Shire were far behind. Hills rose steeper, the soil grew stony, and fences gave way to scrub and scattered boulders. Clouds dragged low over the sky, and even the birds seemed to think better of singing. By then, Bilbo had learned to sit his pony with something like steadiness, though he still shifted whenever the path narrowed. His early chatter about handkerchiefs and regular meals had faded. He listened more and spoke less, as if the road itself were teaching him in a language without words. One evening, after a long day of hard going, we found ourselves in a bleak stretch of country. The wind cut through our cloaks, and the thought of a warm fire felt like something from another life. Thorin frowned at the sky and muttered that we ought to have reached better shelter by then. Gandalf rode ahead and disappeared over a rise without explanation. At first, we did not worry. Wizards appear and vanish according to their own designs. Yet, as the light drained from the land and he did not return, a thin unease settled over us. We were tired. The ponies stumbled. Voices grew short. Bilbo rode hunched in his saddle, nose reddened by the wind, eyes darting from rock to rock. When at last we descended into a shallow hollow where a few twisted trees clung to the soil, even that miserable shelter drew a weary breath of relief from more than one throat. Then we saw it. A flicker of light not far off. The warm pulse of a fire. On such a night, that glow could mean comfort or danger. Thorin weighed the matter quickly. With Gandalf gone and the company worn thin, the wish for food and friendly company was strong, yet the thought of walking blindly into another camp sat poorly with any of us. The talk turned, as it was bound to our burglar. A burglar, we told ourselves, should be able to move quietly, learn who shared the night with us, and return with word before we risked the whole company. Some of the younger dwarves spoke of it with a hint of teasing, eager to see whether Bilbo would live up to the title Gandalf had given him. Thorin agreed, his face set. It was a practical choice, and it was also a test. Bilbo did not like the plan. His protests were polite but firm. He had no training, he said. He had never stolen so much as a spoon. Yet, beneath the fear, there was also a flicker of pride. He had come this far among us, endured rain and cold, and the loss of all his familiar comforts. To be dismissed now as useless would have cut deeper than he cared to show. In the end, he swallowed hard, tugged his cloak around him, and slipped away toward the glow. The minutes that followed stretched unkindly. We waited among the sparse trees, the wind rattling their branches like restless fingers. No one spoke loudly. Blades were checked and rechecked. The firelight beyond the rise wavered and grew, fading in and out of sight, as if it shared our uncertainty. When trouble came, it came at once. A roar of rough laughter tore through the night, followed by a frightened cry in a voice we knew too well. Stealth forgotten, we rushed toward the sound, scrambling up over the lip of the hollow. There, in a trampled patch of ground, beside a smoking fire, stood 3 trolls, large and ill-tempered, arguing over something small that squirmed in one of their hands. They were heavy creatures, greedy and slow-witted, and they had caught our burglar in the act of trying to lift a purse. Bilbo dangled now, terrified and angry, his first attempt at daring having brought him face to face with the coarse side of the wider world. My first feeling, I admit, was anger, not only at the trolls, but at ourselves. We had pushed an untried companion into danger he did not understand, partly to prove a point. There was little time for regret. As more of us rushed into the light, hoping to rescue him, the trolls seized or cornered several of our company. Their talk turned from Bilbo to the prospect of a larger meal. The more we struggled, the worse it grew. Courage and recklessness often share a border that is easiest to see after one has crossed it. Then another voice entered the chaos, speaking from the shadows with an oddly familiar irritation. It chided the trolls for their clumsiness and stirred up their quarrels. They began to argue among themselves, first in low grumbles, then in louder accusations. Each became certain the others meant to cheat him of his share. Insults tangled with confusion. Their thick minds could not hold on to a single thought for long. We recognized that voice. Gandalf had returned. Though we could not see him clearly, we heard his craft in the way he twisted their words back upon them, keeping them bellowing and shoving as the fire crackled and the night thinned. Above the treetops, the sky was turning from black to the grey that comes before dawn. At last, the first pale touch of morning slipped over the horizon. Light spilled into the clearing in a sudden wash. The trolls froze mid-quarrel, too caught up in their shouting to remember the oldest rule of their kind. In a breath, they were no longer living threats, but 3 rough pillars of stone, mouths still open on unfinished curses. The hands that had held Bilbo and seized my companions were now no more than rock. In the quiet that followed, fear dissolved into shaking relief. We crept forward to test the stone, half expecting it to move. Bilbo, bruised and breathless but unhurt, stood close to me and stared up at the petrified shapes. His face was pale, yet there was determination in his eyes. He had been foolish and brave at once and had survived, helped by a wizard's timing and the slow certainty of dawn. We searched the trolls' hiding place and found food, supplies, and weapons of far better make than such owners deserved. At the time, we were mostly grateful for full bellies and the sense that the road had not yet turned entirely against us. As we moved away from that grim little camp, I kept glancing back at the stone figures. They were a warning, and not only about the danger of trolls at night. They reminded me how quickly a careless choice can harden into something lasting. We had almost allowed our impatience and our doubts about Bilbo to fix his fate as surely as the morning had fixed theirs. Think for a moment of times when a hasty decision or a bid to impress others led you into trouble that only luck or another's wisdom pulled you from. Most of us, in one way or another, have stood too close to a fire we did not fully respect. Survival leaves marks and lessons that no gentle advice can replace. But we still wonder whether that night with the trolls was the first time Bilbo Baggins began to see himself not merely as a frightened hobbit far from home, but as someone whose courage, clumsy though it seemed, had a true place in stories larger than the walls of his own snug hole. We carried the memory of the trolls with us as we moved on, along with their spoils. Among the things hidden in their lair, we had found blades of elf make, bright and keen even after long neglect. Gandalf chose from them, and Thorin chose, and at last a short sword was placed in Bilbo's hand. It looked almost like a long knife to my eyes, yet when he drew it, the steel caught the light with a clear, cold gleam. He held it awkwardly at first, as one might hold a new tool whose use is not yet second nature, but there was a gravity in his gaze that had not been there before. The land grew kinder as we left that dark episode behind. Hills softened and the wind lost some of its hard edge. Birds returned to the air in greater number, and the scent of water came on the breeze. Gandalf rode with a quieter satisfaction, as though some private measure of the journey had been met. When we asked about our destination, he only smiled and said that the road was bringing us to a place where tired feet and tired hearts might find a little peace. It was evening when we reached the edge of the hidden valley. The sun was lying low behind the western heights, and the light turned the rocks above us to a burning gold. Then, as we followed a narrow path downward, the world opened. Before us lay a deep cleft in the hills, full of trees and the sound of unseen streams. The air grew cooler, sweeter. The noise of our own movement seemed to hush itself in respect. Rivendell. I had passed through once before in younger days, but the sight still struck me. Houses of pale stone and carved wood nestled among the trees as if they had grown there. Water sang over rock in 1,000 small falls, and the scent of flowers rose to meet us. It was a place made not only for shelter, but for listening. The world's louder sorrows seemed to pause at its borders. Voices reached us long before we saw their owners. Elvish song floated on the air, light and teasing at first, for the elves of that valley knew how to make gentle sport of weary travellers. Their laughter ran along the branches like silver. To some of my kin it stung a little, for we dwarves and elves have long and tangled memories, not all of them kind. Yet even Thorin, who carried those old grievances more heavily than most, could not deny the warmth of the welcome when we reached the heart of the valley. Elrond, master of the house, received us with a calm courtesy that needed no flourish. He was tall and grave, his dark hair falling without ornament, his eyes taking in more than he chose to speak aloud. I felt in him the depth of years, beyond my reckoning. There are beings who carry time differently from the rest of us. To stand near them is to sense the length of the road your own people have walked, and how small a portion of it you have personally trod. For Bilbo, Rivendell was a kind of wonder he had not believed existed outside of stories told by the fireside. I watched him as servants took his pony, and someone placed in his hands a cup of clear, cool drink that smelled faintly of herbs. His shoulders eased, colour returned to his face. When laughter rose among the elves, he did not bristle as Thorin did, but listened, half shy, half delighted, as if the valley itself were a book he had just begun to read. There is an ease in such places that can feel almost dangerous. After hardship, comfort arrives like a soft chair in which one might easily decide to stay. For a few days we were guests rather than wanderers. We slept on clean beds, bathed in warm water, and ate food that tasted of care as much as of skill. Songs were sung in the evenings that were not about sorrow or loss, but about starlight and rivers, and journeys that ended in reunion rather than ruin. Sometimes you may have known a similar respite, perhaps during a visit to a quiet house or a retreat where the noise of your life could not quite find you. For a little while, the burdens you carry do not vanish, but they step into the next room and let you breathe. Rivendell was that pause for us, yet even in rest, the deeper lines of our path were being traced. One night near midsummer, when the moon was bright and the sky clear, Gandalf and Thorin brought forth the map of the lonely mountain. We gathered around a wide table in one of Elrond's chambers, its windows open to the sound of the falling water outside. Bilbo stood close by, curious, clutching his small sword in its new scabbard as if it were a token that allowed him to belong at such councils. Elrond took the map and studied it by lamplight first, tracing the runes that mark the mountain and the secret door on its western side. Then, almost idly, he held it up to the window. When the moonlight fell across the parchment, something changed. Faint lines and letters, invisible before, began to glimmer. Moon letters, written in a hand none of us had expected to see again. Elrond read them aloud slowly, his voice carrying the old dwarven words with surprising ease. They spoke of the key that Thorin carried, of a door that would open only on Durin's Day, when the last light of the setting sun with the moon at the same time would shine upon the keyhole. As he spoke, I felt a shiver pass through the room. It was as if the long reach of our ancestors had reached forward through time to lay a hand upon our shoulders. For Thorin, the revelation was like a spark to embers that had never truly gone out. His face, so often stern, lit with fierce hope. He gripped the key as if it might leap from his grasp, and his gaze turned inward to some vision of reclaimed halls and restored honour. I saw in him not only a leader, but a grandson, hearing a grandfather's voice confirmed from beyond the years. Bilbo listened, eyes wide. The words themselves were strange to him, but the feeling in the room was not. He saw grown dwarves, scarred and seasoned by exile, standing suddenly like children who had been told that the door to their lost home was not entirely closed after all. In that moment he received not only instructions for a hidden lock, but a glimpse of why we had left our scattered lives to follow Thorin's claim. Later, when the others drifted away, I remained a little while in the hall and found Bilbo sitting alone near one of the windows, looking out at the moonlit valley. He seemed both comforted and troubled. He spoke quietly of how strange it was to learn that maps could hide words that appeared only under a certain light. I told him that our lives were not so different. There are meanings in what we endure that only reveal themselves when the right season comes. He laughed softly at that, saying it sounded more like something Gandalf would say. Perhaps it did. Yet I could not shake the feeling that Rivendell had shown us more than hidden ink. It had shown each of us, in its own way, that we were moving along paths prepared long before we set foot upon them. But we still wonder whether, without that night of moon letters and quiet revelation, our courage would have held when the road grew dark again, or whether it was the knowledge of a promised door and a destined day that steadied our steps as we left the valley and its healing waters behind. From Rivendell, the road turned upward and the air thinned. The days grew sharper, and the nights arrived earlier, shouldering the light away before we were ready to let it go. Ahead of us rose the misty mountains, a long grey wall that cut the world in two. Their peaks carried snow even in the kinder seasons. Now, as we approached, clouds wrapped around them like old secrets. Bilbo had begun to find a rhythm in our march. He still puffed and stumbled more than a seasoned traveller, but he no longer looked quite so astonished to find himself outdoors. I sometimes caught him humming snatches of the songs he had heard in Rivendell, the melodies half remembered, the words softly distorted by his Hobbit tongue. It was a small defiance against the looming stone, as if he meant to remind the mountains that there were still warm kitchens somewhere behind us. The path grew rougher underfoot. Stones shifted treacherously. Wind gnawed at the edges of our cloaks. Thorin's gaze remained fixed on the heights, measuring the ridges and gullies with the eye of one who understands that rock can be both protection and trap. Gandalf walked beside him more often, the two of them exchanging short, quiet phrases that did not carry back to the rest of us. It is never entirely comfortable to know that others are reading the dangers ahead while you see only the rocks in front of your boots. One afternoon, a storm rolled down from the higher slopes with a speed that felt almost deliberate. The sky darkened, not in the leisurely way of Shire weather, but with a sudden gathering of cold weight. Lightning clawed at the peaks, and thunder followed so quickly that the sound seemed to crack the air itself. Rain began in hard, slanting lines that turned the path to a slick and treacherous stair. We pressed on for a while, hoping to find some natural shelter. The wind howled between the rocks so fiercely that it snatched breath from our mouths. Bilbo clung to his pony with both hands, his cloak snapping behind him like a frightened bird. Even the dwarves, used to harsher climbs than he had ever imagined, found their patience thinning. It was then that we noticed the strange shapes on the mountainside high above. Huge figures seemed to move against the storm, hurling boulders from one to another as if they were no more than children's toys. The thunder took on a different tone, blended with the deep voices of stone giants at play. Each crashing rock shook the ground beneath us. We pressed close to the mountainside, more gnats than guests in the presence of such careless power. In that chaos, Gandalf found us a cave, little more than a dark wound in the rock, but dry and out of the wind. At any other time, we would have looked twice before trusting such a place. That night, exhaustion and storm drove caution into a corner. We led the ponies in as far as the narrow space allowed, made a small fire, and gratefully lay down upon the hard floor. Bilbo huddled near the warmth, his small sword within reach, though he touched it as if still unsure it belonged to him. The storm raged outside. Thunder rolled overhead. Inside the cave, the steady breath of sleeping dwarves slowly drowned out the noise. I took a turn on watch, my back against the rock, staff across my knees, eyes on the mouth of the cave where lightning sometimes flashed white against the distant cliffs. Nothing moved there but the shifting light. Weariness finally won, and when my watch ended, I lay down with the uneasy comfort of one who has done all he can and must trust to luck for the rest. It is a cruel thing to be awakened not by dawn, but by danger. The cave floor seemed suddenly alive beneath us. A crack yawned open where there had been solid stone. Rough hands seized cloaks and beards and belts. Harsh voices snarled in a language that twisted through the dark like barbed wire. Goblins poured from hidden tunnels, their eyes gleaming in the reflected firelight, their blades catching sparks as they moved. Confusion swallowed us. The ponies screamed. Someone's lantern fell and went out. A few of us fought, but the surprise was too complete. Bilbo vanished in the crush, knocked from his feet, and swept toward the gap along with our packs. One by one, we were dragged down into the depths, the cave swallowing us as neatly as a mouth. The goblin tunnels were a nightmare of foul air and jagged turns. Their captors drove us forward with jabs and jeers, their rancid breath hot on our necks. Torchlight smeared the walls with red and black. The further we went, the more the weight of the mountain pressed upon my chest. I have walked in deep halls all my life, yet there is a world of difference between crafted caverns shaped by loving hands and rough burrows gnawed into rock by malice. We were brought at last into a huge cavern that served as their den. Smoke hung thick under the roof. The goblins swarmed like insects, their chief perched on a raised stone, leering down at us with eyes that gleamed dull and hungry. He spoke of old grudges, of tolls unpaid and debts invented, of the pleasure of tormenting travellers who strayed within reach of his underworld realm. Thorin stood as straight as chains would allow, meeting the goblin leader's gaze with cold contempt. He gave his name and lineage without flinching, as if the filthy cavern were a throne room and he an unshaken king. There was pride in that, but also danger. Goblins respect neither heritage nor honour. His boldness only sharpened their interest in making an example of us. It might have ended there, in darkness and crude laughter and the slow extinguishing of our hopes, had not another light blazed suddenly in the hall. A blinding flash split the murk. For a heartbeat, all sharp edges vanished in white. When my sight cleared, the goblin chief lay dead at the feet of a tall grey figure whose staff still sang with the echo of its blow. Gandalf had come. What followed was a whirl of chaos. Chains were cut, blades flashed, goblins shrieked and scattered. Gandalf drove them back with fire and fear, and we seized the chance to run. We fled through side tunnels, chased by howls and the clatter of feet. The mountain around us became a maze of black passages and uncertain crossings. Rocks tumbled, torches sputtered and died. More than once I thought we were running in circles under the earth while our enemies closed in. At last, by a path I could never retrace, we burst out into a dark corridor lit only by the faintest smear of daylight from somewhere far ahead. We stumbled forward, lungs burning, limbs shaking. One by one we emerged into the open air, falling to our knees on a narrow ledge that clung to the mountain's eastern side. We lay there, panting, tasting freedom in every gasp. The sky above was pale, washed clean by the storm. The world spread out below us in shadow and silver. For a little while we were too grateful to say anything at all. Then someone spoke Bilbo's name. We looked among us and found only dwarves and wizard, no hobbit. The realization passed through the company like a second shock. In the rush of escape, in the struggle to keep our feet, and our lives, we had not noticed his absence. It is a bitter thing to discover that fear for oneself has left no room for fear for another until it is too late. Voices rose, sharp with blame and regret. Some faulted Gandalf for not counting heads. Others muttered that a hobbit had no place in such tunnels, and that this had been the likely end from the start. I held my tongue. In my heart, a quieter voice asked how often we all, in one way or another, rush toward our own survival without looking closely enough at who has fallen behind. Gandalf listened to our outburst with a face lined more deeply than the mountain. He said little, only that the paths under the earth are many, and that the story of our small companion might not be finished yet. We had no choice but to move on. To re-enter the goblin realm would have been to throw away every chance we had just won. We set off again down the mountain path, our steps heavy, each of us glancing back more often than we admitted. The sun rose higher, but its warmth could not quite chase away the chill that had settled when we realized our number was no longer complete. But we still wonder whether that long day with the echo of goblin tunnels behind us and an empty space where a hobbit should have walked was the moment we began to understand the true cost of the road, where every gain in freedom is weighed against those we may lose along the way. Bilbo found us again on the far side of the mountains, though I did not see how he came to it with my own eyes. When he stepped out from among the rocks and stood there blinking in the daylight, it was as if the mountain had decided to give something back it had swallowed. We crowded round him with exclamations and questions, relieved and half incredulous. Only later did I come to understand the path he had walked alone under the earth. At first we saw only the outward marks of his ordeal. His clothes were torn and smeared with grime. His curls were damp with sweat. His face pale in the thin light. Yet there was also a new set to his jaw, and a watchfulness in his eyes I had not seen before. Fear still clung to him, but it had learned to share space with something harder to define. When Thorin demanded an account of how he had escaped, Bilbo gave us a story, though not all of it. He spoke of being knocked aside in the first rush of goblins, of tumbling through blackness, of waking alone in a damp, cold tunnel far from his friends. He told of groping in the dark, one hand on the wall, listening for any hint of the way out, and hearing only the slow drip of water and the distant mutter of goblin voices. He did not then speak of the small ring of gold he had found on the tunnel floor, glinting faintly even in that thick gloom. Nor did he tell us of the creature who had lurked by the underground lake, with pale eyes and a voice that slipped between whining and hate. I learned of those things later, in fragments, from Gandalf and from Bilbo himself, when time had given him room to speak more plainly. Alone, in the dark, it seems, he had met more than one kind of danger. There was the chill of the rock, the threat of getting lost, the thought that goblins might return at any moment. Yet the sharpest trial was stranger. Faced with a creature named Gollum, whose mind had been twisted by long solitude and by the ring he cherished, Bilbo had to gamble his life not on strength, but on words. They had played a game of riddles to decide his fate and Gollum's. Win, and he would be shown the way out. Lose, and he would be food. It is not the sort of contest that finds its way into the training of dwarven warriors. Yet, for a hobbit with quick wits, no sword and nowhere to run, It was the only battlefield that offered him even the slightest advantage. I picture him standing there at the edge of that black water, clutching his little blade, turning familiar puzzles over in his mind, while a pair of pale eyes gleamed at him from the shadows. Each answer brought him another breath. Each new riddle from that rasping voice carried the weight of hunger. He was far from the tidy parlours where such word games usually raise only laughter and harmless groans. You may have faced smaller versions of such moments in your own life, perhaps at a desk when a sudden question demanded a quick answer, or in a conversation where the right phrase could soothe a growing quarrel. Words can be doors or traps. For Bilbo, that night under the mountain, they were both. In the end, he succeeded, though not cleanly. Cornered by a final riddle he could not answer, he stumbled upon a question rather than a puzzle, and Gollum, deceitful by habit, failed his own rules. There is something almost painful in that. Two creatures scared and angry in the dark, bound together by old magic neither of them fully understood, circling one another with language as their only lantern. When Gollum at last realized he had lost more than a game, that his precious ring was gone, the tone of the story changed. Fear turned to fury. The tunnels echoed with his shrieks. Bilbo, fleeing blindly, found himself suddenly more afraid of the thing he carried than of the goblins he had left behind. In that moment, he put the ring on his finger without knowing its true nature, and vanished from sight. Invisible in his enemy's own realm, he slipped past goblins who searched for him with blades and curses, their eyes seeing nothing where he slipped silently along the wall. He followed their hateful voices until he reached a passage that smelled of fresh air and led upward. There at last he faced another choice that weighed heavily on him, though he mentioned it only briefly when he first told the tale. Gollum had come between him and the exit. Invisible and armed, Bilbo could have killed him with ease and freed himself from pursuit. The creature crouched there, miserable and dangerous, hissing to himself in the dark. Instead of striking, Bilbo leaped past him, pity staying his hand where fear alone might have urged him to stab. It may seem a small mercy, extended to a single wretched being in a tunnel no map would ever show. Yet I have come to think of that spared life as a stone dropped into deep water. The ripples, though we could not yet see them, were always bound to reach farther shores. When he told us the story on the mountain ledge, Bilbo skimmed lightly over these quiet depths. He mentioned riddles, yes, and a strange creature, and the stroke of luck that led him through the goblins unnoticed. He spoke of finding the way out with a mixture of pride and embarrassment, as if uncertain how much of his survival was skill and how much was chance. He said nothing of the ring. Only later, when its trick of invisibility could no longer be hidden, did we begin to understand that he had brought more out of the mountain than his own skin. As he finished his tale, some of the company laughed in relief. Others clapped him on the back. Thorin, though slow to praise, nodded once with a look that hinted at grudging respect. For my part, I felt something shift within me. Until then, I had thought of Bilbo mostly as a guest swept up among us. Now I saw that the road had demanded of him a private courage none of us had shared. The tunnels he had walked could not be fully shared in words. There are passages every traveller must go through alone. Think of times when you told others about an experience that had changed you, only to feel that your account left most of its weight unspoken. People nodded, even congratulated you, yet the deepest turn of the heart remained something only you and the dark you had passed through truly knew. Bilbo, drying his curls in the sun and trying to make light of his own fear, stood in just such a place. We set off again with our number restored, Gandalf glancing now and then at the Hobbit with a thoughtful gaze. Danger lay ahead still, and hardship, but something had altered in the pattern of our company. We no longer had simply a small, unwilling burglar to protect. We had a companion who had faced his own night and found within it not only the will to survive, but the stubborn kindness to spare a foe he might easily have killed. But we still wonder whether that unseen choice in a black tunnel, when Bilbo Baggins stayed his hand and leapt toward light instead of blood, did more to shape the fate of our journey than any blow struck in open battle ever could. Beyond the eastern slopes of the misty mountains, the land did not grow gentle at once. It would have been a kindness if the world had given us a longer breath between trials, but that is not how most roads are laid. We had scarcely found our feet again when fresh danger came down upon us from the wild. We were moving through a belt of rough country, rocks and scrub and scattered trees, when the first howls rose. They rolled over the hills in ragged waves, not the distant song of harmless creatures, but the harsh voices of hunting wargs. The sound tightened every muscle in my body. We dwarves know wolves as more than stories. Goblins and wargs often run together, sharing blood and hatred. Soon the howling drew closer. Dark shapes loped across the ridges, their eyes catching the light with a cruel glint. We had no time to form a proper defense. Gandalf shouted for us to climb. We scrambled up the nearest trees, rough trunks clawing at cloaks and palms as we dragged ourselves out of reach. Bilbo, not bred for such work, clung and slipped and scrambled in a desperate tangle, yet somehow he too reached a branch high enough to keep the snapping jaws from his legs. Below us, the clearing filled with wolves, grey and lean, pacing and leaping, their teeth flashing. Goblins soon joined them, hooting and brandishing torches. They laughed to see us trapped like fruit on boughs, our strength and weapons rendered almost useless by height. Smoke rose in thick coils as they would set fire to the trees, the flames licking upward, eager for dry bark. I remember the heat on my face, the sting of the smoke in my eyes, the way Bilbo coughed and wrapped his arms more tightly around his branch. There is a moment in any crisis when the mind runs ahead of the body, measuring all possible escapes and finding none. I felt that chill clarity as the fire climbed and the wolves howled in triumph. It is one thing to choose danger. It is another to see all the doors closing while your heart still beats. Then the wind shifted, and with it the pattern of the flames. The smoke streamed upward in a new way, as if the air itself had decided to change sides. Dark shapes dropped from the high air, broad wings outstretched, talons flashing. Great eagles swept down upon the burning clearing, striking at wolves and goblins, scattering them as a child scatters twigs. Their cries cut through the din, fierce and cold. One after another we felt strong claws seize our cloaks and lift us from the branches, just as the heat became unbearable. The ground fell away, the fire shrinking beneath us. I clutched at the eagle that bore me, feeling the steady power in each beat of its wings. Around me, dangling at varying heights, were dwarves, wizard, and one astonished hobbit, all swinging above the hills like strange fruit carried by the sky. The eagles did not carry us to cities or halls. They brought us to a wide rock high above the land, a great shelf where the air was clean and the sky close. There they left us to rest, watched by bright, distant eyes. Thorin, proud as he was, bowed his head in thanks to our unlikely saviours. We slept that night under the open heavens, too spent to speak much at all. From there Gandalf led us down in gentler stages until we came to the house of Beorn. He was a strange figure, that man of the wild places, with his deep voice, broad shoulders, and quiet eyes that saw more than he said. His home stood in a wide pasture, wooden and solid, surrounded by bees and grazing animals who treated him with a respect that hinted at something more than ordinary. I had heard tales of his kind, skin changers who could take the form of a great bear, though he did not flaunt that power before us. Beorn listened to our story with a mixture of amusement and concern. He grunted at the mention of goblins, nodded sharply when we spoke of wargs, and smiled only once, a brief flicker when Gandalf described Bilbo arriving late and breathless to join us. For a few days he gave us food and beds, and the comfort of a roof that did not threaten to fall upon our heads. His animals moved about the place with a curious order, as if they too understood that this was a refuge. During those quiet days, I watched Bilbo walk in Beorn's wide yard, his bare feet sinking slightly into the soft grass. He seemed smaller than ever against that wild backdrop. Yet he no longer looked entirely like a creature drawn from his depth and tossed among strangers. He spoke with Beorn's animals, fed them, stroked their coats. It was clear that he carried within him an instinct for gentleness that no amount of hardship could strip away. Soon enough we had to leave even that haven. Beorn warned us that the next part of our journey would offer no such pauses. He spoke of Mirkwood, the great forest that lay ahead, with a seriousness that stilled even the most restless tongues among us. "Do not stray from the path," he said. "Do not drink from the black streams. Do not leave the road, no matter what you think you see or hear beneath those trees." When we reached the forest edge at last, the change was like stepping over a threshold into another world. Behind us lay open land, sky and hill and river. Before us stood trees so tall that their branches seemed to knit together far above, weaving a ceiling that shut out the sun. The air under the first rank of trunks was cool and still, tinged with an old dampness. The path plunged into shadow and did not show where it came out again. We stood there a long moment. The ponies shifted, snorting softly. Bilbo looked back once toward the thinning line of day, then squared his shoulders and followed Thorin under the trees. One by one, we went after him, leaving the last clear light behind. Inside Mirkwood, time took on a different shape. Day and night lost their usual meaning. The canopy above let through only a dim green twilight. The air smelled of leaf mould and unseen water. Every sound was muffled, as if the forest were listening and did not wish to be disturbed. The path wound and twisted between trunks that seemed to lean together when our backs were turned. Food grew scarce. Our tempers did the opposite. In that constant half-darkness, small annoyances swelled into sharp words. Bilbo's feet ached on the root-tangled ground. Dori grumbled at every stumble. Even I found old aches in my bones, wakening like forgotten debts. Thorin set his jaw and drove us on, but there were moments when I saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Quickly masked, Hunger is a patient enemy. It gnawed at us day by day, sharpening the scent of every distant rustle that might be game, and making our mouths water at the memory of meals long gone. When distant lights appeared one night among the trees, shifting like lanterns borne by unseen hands, our caution wavered. We followed them against all counsel, lured by the promise of warmth and food. Each time we drew near, the lights vanished. Each time we found only darkness and the sound of our own breathing. In that confusion we lost the path. One moment it lay under our feet. The next it had somehow slipped away into the gloom. We searched, calling softly, our nerves fraying. The forest answered with silence. Exhausted we lay down where we could, and sleep came in ragged snatches. We woke to webs. Fine threads stronger than cables stretched between the trees, glistening faintly in the dim light. Giant spiders moved along them with sickening ease, their bodies heavy, their legs long and swift. Before many of us could reach for weapons, sticky cords had wrapped our limbs. One by one, the dwarves were bound, hoisted, and hung like grim harvest among the branches. Only Bilbo, by luck or the mercy of chance, fell free and rolled into a hollow where the spider's first rush missed him. I remember little of what followed from my own senses. Caught and half-stunned, wrapped tight, I saw only flashes. A spider rearing back with a shrill cry, the glint of a small blade, a figure darting along the branches with a quickness that did not seem possible. Later, when we were safe, Bilbo told us what he had done. Alone, shaking with fear, yet driven by something fiercer, he had slipped on the ring he had found under the mountain and vanished from sight. Invisible, he crept close enough to strike, cutting web cords, stabbing spider bellies, shouting mocking words to draw them after him and away from us. He worked with the desperate ingenuity of someone who has no choice but to be clever. At some point in that frantic struggle he named his sword Sting. It had tasted spider blood and had saved lives, and he felt it deserved a name. Dwarves understand this instinct. To name a blade is to acknowledge that it has shared in the shaping of your fate. I think that moment did as much to change Bilbo as any wound or victory. For the first time he saw himself not as a passenger on our quest, but as one of its active protectors. When at last the webs were cut and the spiders driven off, we collapsed on the forest floor, shaking and weak, but free. We looked at Bilbo with a new respect. This was no longer the hobbit who had fretted over handkerchiefs and regular meals. This was someone who had faced terror in the dark and moved anyway, for our sake as much as his own. You may have known, in smaller ways, what it is to be forced into action not because you feel ready, but because no one else can move. Perhaps in a family crisis or a quiet disaster at work, when the usual leaders faltered and the task fell to you. Such moments reveal not a different person, but a deeper layer of the one you have always been. But we still wonder whether, without that grim dance among the webs of Mirkwood, Bilbo Baggins would ever have come to see the strength that lay hidden under his own fear, or whether it took the sight of his friends hanging helpless above him to call forth the courage that had waited all along in the quiet heart of a hobbit from the Shire. Freedom in Mirkwood was a narrow thing. We had escaped the spiders with our lives, but not with our strength. Hunger gnawed at us. Weariness settled into our bones like damp. The forest seemed endless, every tree like the last, every step leading us deeper into a twilight that refused to break. We were still trying to find the lost path when the next trouble came. The air grew thicker, touched by a faint scent of smoke and something sweeter behind it, like wine. Strange lights flickered again among the trunks, though these were steadier than the mocking lanterns we had chased before. Voices drifted toward us, lighter than goblin growls, full of a music that did not fit this heavy wood. Elves. Their presence was like a blade drawn in an old wound. Thorin stiffened as soon as the first voices reached us. The history between our peoples lay on his shoulders, a weight he had carried since youth. Trade disputes, ancient quarrels, the memory of abandoned allies when dragons came and gold burned. I could feel his pride bristle at the thought of appearing weak before them. Yet we were weak. Our mouths were dry. Our belts hung looser. When we stumbled into a glade filled with lamplight and the scent of roasted meat, and saw elves gathered around tables under the branches, it was like waking in a dream of comfort. Their garments glowed faintly in the dimness. Their hair shone like starlight caught in the leaves, and their laughter cut through the gloom as if it had no knowledge of our hard days. The vision vanished almost as soon as we saw it, leaving only dark trees and silence. Twice more we followed such gatherings, driven by need, and twice more they faded before we could reach them. On the last attempt, chaos scattered us completely. In the confusion of lights and vanishing feasts, each dwarf stumbled in a different direction, seeking food or comfort and finding only deeper confusion. I do not know exactly how the elves of Mirkwood caught us, only that one by one we found ourselves surrounded by archers who stepped from behind tree trunks with the silent assurance of hunters long at ease in their own domain. Their king's soldiers bound our hands, collected our weapons, and drove us along winding paths deeper under the heavy boughs. Their halls lay underground, though not like goblin lairs. The stone was shaped, the passages ordered, the doors carved with leaves and flowing lines. Light came from hidden lamps that glowed softly on polished floors. It was not a place of cruelty, yet it was not home. The king sat upon his carved throne with a crown of berries and leaves upon his head, and a gaze that weighed us like merchants' goods. Thorin, brought before him first, stood proud, despite the stains of travel and battle. He gave his name plainly, and asked for food and freedom, withholding any word of our true purpose, or of the mountain that lay beyond the forest. The king's questions tasted of curiosity and caution. He did not threaten us with torture or death, only with long imprisonment, unless we told him what he wished to know. Thorin's jaw tightened, and he refused. For that refusal, we were cast into separate cells, iron bars shut between us and the hallways. No chains, no cruelty, but stone walls and locked doors. Food was brought, simple and sufficient, yet the knowledge of being penned like animals scraped at our pride. I spent many hours pacing the limits of my narrow prison, listening for any echo of my companions' voices, and hearing only the faint sounds of elvish life above and beyond. Bilbo, of course, was not among us. In the confusion of capture, he had slipped the ring onto his finger and vanished from sight, unknown to our keepers. That small fact changed everything, though we did not grasp it at once. To the elves, their tally of captives was complete. To us, it seemed that our burglar had been lost again, swallowed by the forest, or by worse. I learned later that he moved among the halls like a quiet ghost, unseen and unheard, slipping through doors as guards passed, hiding behind barrels and screens when footsteps approached. He listened. Hobbits are good listeners when they choose to be, and invisibility gave that gift a sharper edge. He heard where the wine was stored, how the raft elves came and went along the river that ran under the halls, how the guards complained about their duties, and where they left their keys when they drank too deeply. Meanwhile, we sat in our cells and argued with our own thoughts. Some muttered that Thorin's stubbornness had brought us to this. Others defended him, saying that we could not bend our necks to every ruler we met, that dwarven honour was not a cloak to be taken on and off at convenience. I found myself caught in between. I love Thorin, I respect his lineage and his courage, yet I also knew that pride can cost as dearly as cowardice. You may have felt something similar in your own life. When a leader you trust refuses to compromise, there is often a fine line between admiration and frustration. One part of you stands a little taller at their unbending stance. Another counts the cost that you and others must pay for that same refusal. Loyalty does not clear that tension. It only teaches you to live with it. Days blurred. We were visited by the king from time to time. He asked new questions in slightly different ways, as if hoping our answers might change if approached from another angle. They did not. Thorin's silence held, so did our ignorance. We did not know whether Bilbo lived, much less what he might be doing if he did. Then, one day, my cell door swung open without warning. There stood no elf with a tray or a command, only emptiness, and faintly a whisper urging me to step out. I stared at the open passage, wondering whether this was some trick. The whisper came again, closer, with a note of impatience I recognized only after a moment. Bilbo. He pulled me into the shadows, tugging at my sleeve with a firm urgency that belied his small size. In a hushed voice, he told me of the plan he had spent days shaping. The river that ran under the halls carried empty barrels down to Lake Town after the elves had used them. Those barrels, he said, would carry us too. It sounded absurd. It was also the only plan we had. He moved quickly from cell to cell, slipping keys from hooks, unlocking doors, steadying each of us with a few quiet words as he explained. We had to trust him now, as completely as we had once doubted him. There was a strange reversal in that. The burglar we had dragged from his respectable life and treated as little more than excess baggage now held the map of our freedom in his head. The work that followed was cramped, wet, and undignified. One by one, we were led to the lower cellars, where barrels waited in neat rows. Bilbo coaxed and commanded as if he had been born to the task. Into each barrel a dwarf climbed, curling limbs and beard as best he could. The lids were hammered shut above us. Darkness closed in. The smell of damp wood filled my nose. I will not pretend I bore it cheerfully. Pride is a fierce companion. To be packed like goods, without light or certainty, rattling in the hands of elves who would not have chosen to export us, galled me more than chains had done. Yet I also knew this. Without Bilbo's daring, we would have rotted politely in our cells, honour intact, and story ended. The plunge into the water came with a jolt that knocked the breath from my lungs. cold river rose around the barrel, seeped through cracks, turned every movement into a slow, sodden struggle for balance. The current seized us. We rolled and bumped, spinning through blackness. From within the barrel, the world reduced itself to motion and noise, wood creaking, water slapping, the distant rumble of falls and locks and shouted commands. At last, the battering eased. The barrels drifted in calmer water. Voices with a different accent reached my ears. Lakemen, not elves. After a long while, lids were pried open and fresh air spilled down upon us. One by one, we were hauled out, bruised, stiff and dripping, blinking against the torchlight on wet stone. That was how we came to Lake Town, not as a noble company arriving under banners, but as half-drowning cargo, supervised by one invisible hobbit, shivering on the edge of a new chapter we did not yet understand. But we still wonder whether those dark hours in wine cellars and river barrels did not do more to humble and reshape our proud company than any formal audience with kings, teaching us that sometimes the road to freedom runs through indignity, guided by the quiet courage of the least likely companion among us. We came to Lake Town sodden and sore, crawling out of the barrels onto wet planks, while the night air bit through our clothes. My beard was full of splinters, and my limbs felt as if the river itself had hammered them. Around me, dwarves coughed and staggered, blinking at the ring of torches. Only Bilbo stood already on the pier, dripping but upright, looking more like a bedraggled water rat than the burglar who had saved us. The men of the lake gaped at the sight. They had expected empty casks from the woodland realm, not a band of armed strangers pouring out of their freight. Lamps burned along narrow walkways raised on piles above the dark water. Houses leaned over the channels, their windows glowing softly. The air smelled of pitch, wet timber and fish, a hard-working scent that spoke of lives lived between flood and frost. Questions flew at us from every side. Who were we? Where had we come from? Why had the elves sent us floating like so much cargo? Cold and tired as we were, Thorin did not let the moment pass. He stood as straight as his battered body allowed and gave his name in a clear voice, not as a wanderer, but as Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, king under the mountain. The title fell on the crowd like a spark on dry grass. Murmurs rose into shouts. For these people, the lonely mountain was not a tale from distant lands. It loomed at the head of their lake, a dark shape against the northern sky. Their fathers had told them of days when trade flowed down from its gates, when gold and crafted goods came by river and prosperity sat easily at their tables. They had also heard of fire in the clouds and ruin on the shore when the dragon came. Old songs were dragged up from memory, as if they had been waiting just below the surface of everyday talk. Someone began a simple chant about the king returning and the river running with gold. Others joined, their voices rough but eager. Hope can be a hungry thing. They saw in Thorin not only a weary dwarf, but a promise that lean years might end. The master of Lake Town arrived then, robed in good cloth, flanked by guards with polished spears. He looked surprised, as he was expected to look, yet his eyes were busy weighing what he saw. The crowd pressed close around us, shouting Thorin's name, calling him their king, declaring that at last fortune had turned. The master could not swim against that current. He welcomed us with smooth words, spoke of friendship and mutual gain, and ordered that we be housed and fed at the town's expense. For 3 days we tasted comfort as we had not done since Rivendell. Dry garments, hot food, roofs that did not drip, beds that did not move with the water under them. A healer tended cuts and bruises. Smiths tightened straps and straightened bent buckles. There were toasts in the hall, rough music on the piers, curious glances wherever we walked. People looked at us as if the future itself had stepped ashore on their quay. Bilbo sat next to me at one of the feasts, wrapped in a borrowed cloak that nearly swallowed him. His plate was full, yet he ate slowly, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. When I asked what troubled him, he smiled a little and said he had never before been cheered for work that still lay ahead. The dragon was not dead, he reminded me quietly. The mountain had not yet opened its doors. The truth of that lay heavy on me. The songs in Lake Town spoke of gold poured down river, of bells ringing, of joy returning to ruined dale. None of them spoke of charred stone, of the smell of old smoke, of the risk of waking a sleeping fire. The men wanted a story with a bright ending, and they were willing to borrow our lives to finish it. Their hope warmed us and bound us at the same time. The master visited us often, speaking smoothly of arrangements. Boats would be provided for the journey up the lake. Supplies could be advanced against the treasure we were sure to reclaim. In return, Lake Town would expect its share of future trade and honor. It was all very reasonable. Underneath the courtesy lay clear intent. He meant to tie the fate of his small town to our quest, in such a way that if we rose, he would rise with us, and if we fell, he could say that he had only acted in good faith. Bilbo watched these talks from the edges of the room, unnoticed by most. Hobbits have a talent for seeming smaller than they are. Later, walking with me along a damp boardwalk, he remarked in a mild tone that it was curious how quickly people believed in a prophecy once they had counted their likely profits from it. I laughed, though I could not deny the truth in his words. At last, the day came for us to leave. The whole town seemed to gather on the quays. Children waved from balconies. Fishermen leaned on their poles. Women in worn shawls lifted their voices in songs that blended hope with old fear. Boats waited at the water stairs, loaded with food, gear, and the goodwill of a people who had pinned too much on us. We climbed aboard, our boots thudding on wet planks. Thorin took his place in the prow of the leading boat. To the watchers on shore, he must have looked every inch a returning king. Cloak stirring in the wind, gaze fixed on the dark line of the northern shore. From where I sat, I saw also the strain at the corners of his mouth, the tension in his shoulders as the cheers swelled. As the oars dipped and the distance widened, Lake Town shrank to a scatter of lights, trembling on the water. The noise of the crowd faded, leaving only the slap of waves against the hull. Ahead, the lonely mountain rose higher with every stroke, no longer a distant story, but a looming truth. Bilbo stood beside me in silence, his eyes on that shadowed peak. I could not tell whether the look on his face was dread, resolve, or some mixture of both. Hope, fear, pride, doubt, all rode with us in those narrow boats. Behind us, a town leaned on our success. Before us lay a dragon and the broken land around his lair. We had come far, yet, in many ways, the true test had not yet begun. But we still wonder whether those bright days in Lake Town when we were crowned with other people's expectations and sent northward on a tide of borrowed confidence, did not already begin to twist Thorin's heart toward a vision of glory that would prove as perilous as any enemy waiting in the halls of the lonely mountain. The boats bore us north until the lake narrowed into a running river. Mist clung to the water at dawn, and the lonely mountain swelled on the horizon like a thought that would not leave. From Lake Town it had been no more than a dark shape. Now its slopes filled the sky. Bare rock showed through a thin skin of grass. Old walls and watchworks clung to its lower ridges like broken teeth. My heart tightened whenever I looked up. Once I had walked the halls under that peak at my father's side. Now I approached it as an exile who had spent most of his life learning not to expect this return. Bilbo watched it too, though with other thoughts behind his eyes. For him, the mountain was not a lost home, but the end of a promise he had never planned to make. He stood in the bow as the boats scraped at last against a stony shore, his small hand clenched around the hilt of his sword. There was no cheering crowd here, only the sighing of the wind and the low murmur of the river as it turned aside. The lake men helped us unload, glancing often at the peak with a mixture of hope and dread. They were brave in their own way, but no coin could pay them to step within that blasted circle of land. They left us with food, tools, and formal wishes for success that did not quite hide their relief at turning their boats downstream. When their oars faded, silence rose. We were alone at the feet of the mountain. The land around it still carried Smaug's mark. Trees were sparse, twisted by fire. The ground was scored with black channels where streams had once run before being choked with ash and stone. No bird sang in that ring of waste. The only sound was our own breathing and the scrape of gear on rock. We did not go near the great broken gate where the river flowed under a shattered arch. Once our people had marched in and out there with banners. Now the opening gaped like a missing tooth. Instead, we turned to the secret that had brought us this far. The hidden door on the western side, marked on Thror's map in ink and moon letters. Day after day, we searched the western spur. From below, we must have looked like ants on a grey wall. We tried every crack and ledge, every scar where frost had bitten or time had flaked away the stone. Our hands bled, our patience frayed. Hope, so loud in Lake Town, shrank to a stubborn whisper. Bilbo climbed with us, though his feet were made for hobbit paths. His breath grew harsh on the steeper stretches, yet he did not complain as he once might have done. He watched, listened, and when our tempers snapped, he offered small, steadying remarks that reminded us to rest, to drink, to try the next ridge instead of cursing the last. At last, we found it, not as a grand revelation, but as a faint line where the rock did not ring quite true under the tap of our tools. A bare wall between two narrow ledges, so plain that no traveller would see more than cliff and shadow. Yet, under careful tracing, an outline emerged. The arch of a tall, narrow door, smooth and shut. The keyhole eluded us. We knew it must exist, hidden in some cunning fashion, but our fingers found only unbroken rock. The days slipped by. The provisions from Lake Town dwindled. The mountain hung over us with the weight of both hope and threat. To have come so far and be held outside by a door we could see but not open was a cruelty none of us had expected. We watched the western sky as the sun slid each day toward the horizon, remembering Elrond's words. The last light of the setting sun with the moon at the same time upon the keyhole. When exactly that would occur, no one could say. We kept our vigil, nerves drawn tight as bowstrings. In the evenings, I sometimes found Bilbo sitting apart, looking from the sealed rock to the dark valley beyond. When I joined him, he would ask quietly about the halls under the mountain as they had been. I told him what I could: the ring of hammers on anvils, the smell of hot metal, the way lamplight glowed on veins of ore. He listened without interrupting, as if trying to imagine himself inside those memories. The day came at last when the air held a different edge. We climbed to the ledge as we had on so many other afternoons, and took our places before the hidden door. Hours crept by. Then a thrush flew down onto a nearby rock, its speckled breast catching the light. It cracked a snail against the stone with hard, ringing blows. The sound struck Thorin like a remembered note. He straightened, eyes burning. Just as the sun slid to the lip of the horizon, a narrow ray of light shot across the face of the cliff. It struck a single point in the center of the door's outline, and for a heartbeat, a tiny keyhole shone there. Thorin cried out and sprang forward, fumbling at his chain. The key his grandfather had carried all those years came free and slid, as if it had always been meant to, into that brief, shining mark. Stone grated. The line of the door deepened and shifted. Slowly a narrow opening appeared. Cold air breathed out, dry with the dust of many sleeping years. No dragon's roar followed, no blast of fire. Only the quiet exhale of a secret long kept. We stood there, dwarves and hobbit together, looking into a darkness that smelled not only of fear, but of possibility. Thorin's face shone with triumph, the light of long-delayed fulfillment. Yet when he turned to us and spoke of who must first descend, it was not his own name he called. It was Bilbo's. But we still wonder whether, as the hidden door of the lonely mountain opened at last, and the chill breath of its inner ways touched our faces, the weight that truly shifted was not the stone before us, but the balance in Bilbo Baggins's heart between the comfort he had left behind and the perilous purpose that waited now in the dark below. It is one thing to stand before a newly opened door, and quite another to send someone through it. When the rock of the secret entrance ground back and left that tall slit in the mountainside, a shiver passed through our company. Behind us lay the long road, the spiders and goblins, the cells of the Elf King, and the cheers of Lake Town. Before us lay darkness, a dragon, and the horde that had haunted Thorin's dreams since boyhood. Cold air flowed out of the passage, smelling of stone and old ash. No sound came from within. Thorin stood nearest, hand on his sword. For a heartbeat I thought he would step in first. Then his gaze turned to Bilbo. "You are our burglar," he said. "The time has come." The hobbit, who had once protested about handkerchiefs, simply drew a breath, slipped the ring onto his finger, and vanished from our sight. We heard his light steps for a little while, fading down the stone tunnel, then only the faint moan of the mountain itself. We were left on the ledge, with our own fear, and the knowledge that the smallest among us now carried our greatest risk. When Bilbo returned from that first descent, he appeared suddenly in the doorway, pale and shaking, dust in his curls. In his hand he held a single golden cup. His voice trembled as he spoke of what he had seen. Smaug stretched on his bed of treasure, red gold and immense, breath rolling through the hall like a steady furnace. Even in terror there was wonder. No song had prepared him for wealth piled like hills around a living fire. Thorin's eyes fixed on the cup. To him it proved that the hoard could be reached. To me it was a warning. Dragons feel every coin as if it were their own skin. To steal even one piece is to stir the whole beast. We did not wait long for the answer. Deep under our feet a roar rose that made the stone quiver. Smaug had woken and found his hoard disturbed. The sound reached us even on the high ledge, thick with rage and wounded pride. He raged through his chambers, smashing pillars, sending avalanches of gold and gems, crashing like rivers. Bilbo, driven by dread and duty, went down again. Invisible under the ring, he crept close enough to trade words with the dragon. I did not hear that talk, but I learned its shape from Bilbo's telling. Smaug's voice, he said, filled the great hall even when it dropped to a purr. His words stroked and clawed at once, flattering this unseen thief in the shadows while sniffing for his secrets. Bilbo answered in riddles, giving away as little as he could. Two things in that exchange shaped all that followed. First, with hobbit eyes sharpened by fear, Bilbo noticed a small place on Smaug's underside, where the golden scales and encrusted jewels did not fully cover the flesh. A bare patch near the left breast, tiny beside that vast body. Yet it was a flaw. Second, Smaug began to guess more than Bilbo meant to reveal. He smelled dwarf on him and pony and distant water. From that scent he leapt to a hard conclusion. If enemies lurked at his very door, there must be helpers downriver, at the lake that had long watched his mountain. His anger narrowed. If his treasure could not yet be touched, those who had dared to hope for its recovery could. When at last he burst out of the mountain, we felt the world shake. Hot air roared through the eastern gate as Smaug hurled himself into the sky, a streak of flame against the stars. From our hidden western ledge we saw only a red glare moving south, but every beat of his wings seemed to strike our chests. We knew where he was going. That night in Lake Town, the dragon fell upon them. He swooped low over the wooden streets, sending fire along the boardwalks and roofs. Houses burned like dry reeds. The lake steamed where his breath struck the water. People fled into boats or fought the flames with bare hands and buckets. The songs they had sung for Thorin turned in a moment to cries. Amid that chaos stood Bard, the grim archer of the town. Arrow after arrow glanced from Smaug's jewelled hide. Then a thrush flew near and beat its wings, chattering in a tongue few still understood. Some old knowledge woke in Bard. He listened, and the bird's message reached him. Aim for the hollow in the dragon's left breast. He set his last black arrow to the string. While Smaug wheeled high over the burning town, Bard waited for the one right moment. When the great belly turned and that small vulnerable place showed, he loosed. The shaft flew straight and struck deep into the bare patch Bilbo had seen. Smaug screamed, then plunged, a ruin of flame and weight, into the dark water. Steam and smoke rose. When they cleared, the dragon of the lonely mountain was no more. Silence followed. In the mountain, the constant sense of being watched by a hidden hunger faded. Yet if we thought Smaug's death meant the end of danger, we were fools. News moves along rivers faster than dragons fall. Word spread that the king under the mountain's halls now stood empty of their terrible guardian. Men spoke of abandoned gold. Bard, standing in the ruins of his town, looked north and saw both the need of his people and a claim upon the treasure that had once brought ruin to Dale. The elf king, hearing that the old threat was gone and that men were moving toward the mountain, gathered his own host. We knew little of this as we crept deeper into the mountain's heart, hearing only the echo of our steps and the faint shifting of long-piled treasure. The dragon was gone. The way to the hoard stood open, but each gleam in that dimness already seemed touched by other eyes, other hands, reaching, other voices preparing to say, "This is mine." But we still wonder whether the fall of Smaug, which seemed to clear our path at last, did not in truth open a more dangerous struggle, one kindled not by a beast's breath, but by the claims and wounds of all who believed that, with the dragon dead, they now held a rightful share in the gold under the mountain. Within the mountain, after Smaug's fall, days blurred. We moved through the great halls as if walking inside a memory. The dragon's shadow was gone, yet a different unease crept in, thin as mist. The treasure lay in vast chambers, hills of gold and rivers of silver. I had heard Thorin speak of this hoard since my youth, but the reality stunned me. Cups, mail, carved figures and coins lay in heaps. For a time we did little but wander and touch. It felt as if a language long lost to us had suddenly returned. Thorin walked among the heaps, naming pieces, recalling old stories. At first his wonder matched ours. Then slowly his gaze changed. The light in his eyes hardened. He spoke less of home and more of possession. What was ours? What had been stolen? What must never again be yielded? His hand stayed often on the key at his neck or the hilt of his sword. It was Bilbo who found the Arkenstone. He told me later that it lay half buried in a mound of coins, not the largest jewel, yet somehow greater than the rest. A great white stone whose heart burned with a slow, cold fire. When he lifted it, the dim hall around him seemed to fall away. He held in his small hands not just a gem, but the symbol of Thorin's line, the heart of our old kingdom. He might have carried it straight to Thorin. Instead, he slipped it into his pocket beside the ring and said nothing. I do not think he fully understood his own hesitation. Perhaps he sensed that to place that stone now in Thorin's hands would be to feed a hunger already growing too strong. Outside, news moved on the wind. Ravens came and went. From them we learned that Laketown lay in ruins. Its people gathered on the shore under Bard's leadership. The old master had fled with what coin he could carry. The elf king marched with a host, and together they turned their eyes toward the mountain. Bard had killed the dragon and lost much in the fire. He believed, not unreasonably, that some portion of the hoard owed itself to the rebuilding of his people's lives. We sent no message. Thorin listened to the ravens, then called for stone and timber. The front of the great gate was repaired and strengthened. New walls raised to turn the broken entrance into a fortress. Other dwarves were summoned from the Iron Hills. If the outside world thought our treasure an open chest, he said, they would soon find it otherwise. I watched him pacing the cleared hall, counting, planning, his eyes bright with a fierce light that owed nothing to the torches. When I spoke with Gandalf, he sighed and named it dragon sickness, the old madness that clings to hordes long ruled by a worm. I winced at the phrase, for Thorin was my friend and lord. Yet even I could see that he had begun to look at us not as companions, but as part of the mass of things he must hold. The host of men and elves reached the valley and set up camp before the gate. Bard came forward under a white flag, not with threats, but with claims. He asked for aid for Lake Town and for a share in the treasure, given the ruin Smaug had brought and the arrow he himself had fired. Thorin answered from the rampart, courteous in words and unyielding in substance. He would not treat while armed forces stood at his door. When the needy were relieved, it would be as a gift, not at sword point. Until our kinsman from the Iron Hills arrived, he said no chest would be opened. With that, he shut the gate and ordered yet stronger defences. Inside the mountain, the air thickened. Some of our company muttered that men and elves were vultures circling the dragon's corpse. Others, myself among them, could not entirely ignore the justice of Bard's plea. Our suffering lay in the past. Theirs still rose in the morning air. Yet Thorin's fear of losing his regained kingdom wrapped itself around his judgment like mail. Bilbo watched all this with growing worry. He heard Bard's messengers call up to us, offering peace if only a fair share were granted. He saw Thorin's shoulders stiffen whenever the word share was spoken. He listened to ravens speaking of Dain's approach with a company of armoured dwarves, and imagined what would happen when one proud army within the mountain and another proud army without came suddenly face to face. One cold night, while Thorin brooded over his maps and lists, Bilbo made his decision. Most of us had gone to our hard beds. Quietly, he wrapped his cloak around him, slipped on the ring, and walked unseen through our own defences. He climbed down from the rocks, small feet feeling for holds on the rough stone, until he reached the valley floor. He went alone into the camp of those we were calling our enemies. I picture him stepping out of the darkness at the edge of the firelight, taking off the ring, lowering his hood so they could see his face. The men reaching for swords. The elf king's eyes narrowing, Bard lifting a hand for silence. There stood a single hobbit, damp with mountain mist, terrified, yet standing his ground. From his pocket Bilbo drew the Arkenstone. Its light bloomed over tents and armour, over haggard faces lined by smoke and hardship. He named it and placed it in Bard's hands. Here, he said, was the one thing Thorin valued above all other treasures. Use it to bargain, to force him to listen without bloodshed. He asked no reward, only that the quarrel might end before swords were drawn between those who had all suffered under the same dragon. In that act, Bilbo stepped outside every easy boundary. He broke Thorin's trust in order to serve Thorin's better nature. He risked his life among strangers for the sake of a peace they had not promised. It is not the sort of courage sung in simple lays, for it sits uneasily with words like loyalty and honour that prefer clean lines. But we still wonder whether that night, when Bilbo Baggins gave the heart of our horde to those beyond our walls, did not show more true faith in friendship and in the possibility of understanding than all the defiant speeches hurled from the heights of the lonely mountain. Bilbo came back before dawn. I was on watch when I saw a small shadow climbing over the broken rocks toward the gate, slipping and catching. For an instant my hand went to my axe. Then he took off the ring, and his face appeared in the grey light, pale and tired. He said that the night was cold and that he had been walking. There was a set to his mouth that did not match his words. I meant to question him, but Thorin called from within the gate, and I left Bilbo with his secrets and the thinning stars. Soon after sunrise, the camp in the valley stirred. Banners lifted, horns sounded. Bard of the Lake and the Elven King came forward together under a white flag. They halted beyond bowshot and called up to us, their words clear in the thin air. They said they held the Arkenstone. At first I thought I had misheard. That jewel had lain at the centre of Thorin's longing all his life. Yet, when Thorin demanded proof, Bard raised something in his hand, and even at that distance we saw the pale fire of the stone answer the morning. A murmur ran along the wall. To see the heart of our old kingdom shining in other hands was like feeling the floor tilt beneath our feet. For Thorin it was more than shock. His face turned hard as newly cooled steel. He shouted that the stone was his by right, that those who held it must have stolen it. Bard answered that it had been given freely by one of Thorin's own companions, and that he now offered it in exchange for aid to the burned town and a share of the treasure. All eyes turned inward. Thorin's gaze moved along our line, searching. Before he could speak a name, Bilbo stepped forward. He did not look heroic. His hair was rumpled, his clothes still stained from tunnels and barrels and forest. Yet his voice, when he confessed, did not shake. He said that he had found the Arkenstone, that he had taken it, and that he had carried it to Bard so that there might be bargaining instead of blood. The silence that followed was worse than any shout. Thorin stared at him as if something inside him had been cut away. I saw anger there, and also a deep hurt. To him this was not only treachery over a jewel, it was the breaking of the thin trust he had finally given this small outsider. He commanded that Bilbo be seized. No one moved. We owed the Hobbit much. To take him as a thief at an enemy's word went against more than our pride. At last, a few of the younger dwarves stepped toward him, uncertain. Bilbo did not resist. He said quietly that he asked only his promised 14th share, and that he had already given that away to the people of the lake. In the end, Thorin did not hand him to Bard. He could not bend that far. Instead, he spoke words that hurt more than blows. He declared that Bilbo was no longer of our company, that he had forfeited all rights and welcome, that he should be gone before nightfall. I walked with him to the gate when it opened just enough to let a single person slip through. In the shadow of the stone he looked up at me and smiled a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. I tried to thank him and to ask him why in the same breath. The words tangled. He only told me to keep my head and to look after Thorin if I could. We watched from the wall as he crossed the rough ground toward the tents of men and elves. No arrows flew. They met him with surprise, and, after a moment, with respect. I saw the Elven King incline his head. That picture has stayed with me. A hobbit in a worn coat, walking alone between two great camps, while a mountain full of gold glowered above them. That night, Thorin shut himself in the great hall, drawing what remained of the horde close as if to build a wall of metal around his fear. The Arkenstone's loss tormented him. He spoke of Daeins coming from the Iron Hills, of breaking the siege, of teaching elves and men their place. Around the outer fires our company argued in low voices. Some cursed Bilbo's name, others said that he had done what we should have done, ourselves. At dawn, a smear of dust showed on the southern horizon. Dain had come, steel bright and banners flying. My heart lifted at the sight of mailed dwarves marching beneath our colours. Yet when they drew near and we saw the ranks of men and elves form to bar their way, my gladness twisted into dread. Two proud hosts faced each other in the valley, weapons ready, tempers raw. Bard called once more to the gate. "Honour the pledge sealed by the Arkenstone," he said, "and there need be no battle." Thorin refused. His words were like stones dropped from the wall. On the slopes below, shields locked together. Horns gave their first harsh notes. Stones and arrows began to fly, testing range and nerve. Then the ravens came. They wheeled over the valley, crying warnings. From the eastern ridges a long dark line poured, moving too quickly and too unevenly to be any ordered host. It flowed over the hills like spilt ink. Soon we could see the truth of it. Goblins and wolves in great number, drawn by the rumour of treasure and the scent of hate. Gandalf stepped between the lines, his staff raised, his cloak snapping in the rising wind. His voice rang out across the field, naming the new enemy and the doom that awaited us if we chose to fight each other instead of them. For a long breath the valley held still. Then shields shifted, banners turned, orders were shouted not against former foes, but toward the dark wave rolling in from the heights. But we still wonder whether, without the wound opened by Bilbo's gift of the Arkenstone, our hearts would have been soft enough to turn in that moment, or whether we would have clung to anger until goblin steel taught us too late how small our quarrel over gold truly was. When the goblins spilled over the ridges, the valley altered in a heartbeat. Dwarves on the wall, elves on the slope, and men by the river, all turned outward toward the dark flood. Horns sounded, shields locked, banners swung to face the same direction. It felt less like sudden heroism than anger at last remembering its true enemy. Beside me at the gate, Thorin straightened, as if a weight had slid from his shoulders, and his eyes left the treasure behind us. His call to arms rang clear and steady, and we went out together under his command into a clash of dust and steel, every step forward feeling like a small refusal to let the dark have the world to itself. Through the shifting haze I saw Thorin again and again at the fiercest points. He did not stand behind us to count blows from safety. He threw himself where our line had bent, calling our people after him and turning breaks into solid ground until, for that hour, the sickness of gold slid from him and he was only a shield before his own. At last the eagles dropped from the cloud like falling stars, and Beorn crashed into the goblin ranks, and the black tide broke and ran. When the clamour thinned, it left the heavy quiet of a field that would never sound the same, and among the wounded they carried back within the gate was Thorin Oakenshield. We laid him on a bier in a great chamber just inside the mountain, stone walls still bearing the scars of dragon fire. The healers did what they could, yet their eyes told the truth before their words did. The wounds were too deep, the thread of his life pulled too far. When his gaze cleared, it held not the restless gleam of the horde, but a tired honesty, as if he had stepped out from under a long shadow. They sent for those he would most wish to see. Among them, of course, was the Hobbit from the Shire. Bilbo came quietly, still unsteady from the blow that had felled him during the fighting. Dust streaked his face, yet he walked straight to Thorin's side and gripped the edge of the bier. When Thorin's eyes found him, bitterness was gone. He spoke first, in a rough but steady voice, asking Bilbo to pardon his anger and admitting that he had let love of gold drown out what he owed to loyalty and friendship. He said the world would be better if more folk loved simple cheer and song above hoarded wealth. It was not a speech for a crowd, only a man trying to set his heart in order before the end. Bilbo wept and stammered that he too had gone against trust, that he had given away the jewel Thorin prized most. Thorin's hand lifted with effort and came to rest on the Hobbit's arm. That touch held more forgiveness than any set of words. For a little while the mountain seemed to hold its breath. There was treasure on every side of us, yet in that moment the richest thing in that hall was the quiet peace between a dying king and a small companion who had never meant to be a hero. When Thorin's breath at last slowed and ceased, the silence that followed felt vast. We laid him to rest deep under the lonely mountain he had regained, the Arkenstone upon his breast, and his sword beside him. Bard and the Elven King stood with us and bowed their heads. Whatever had once divided our peoples softened for a while by shared danger and grief. Afterward, Dain took up the crown and tried to rule with clearer eyes, having seen what fear and greed can do, while Bard turned back to his ruined town and the long work of building again. The treasure was counted and divided as justly as we knew how. It did not heal every wound, but it was better than the ashes and bitterness that might have stood there instead. When Bilbo's turn came, he might have claimed a fortune. Instead, he chose 2 small chests and a few keepsakes, enough to make a hobbit comfortable and no more. He had walked through halls where gold lay like gravel underfoot, and had seen what such wealth can do to a mind already burdened. He wanted something he could enjoy without being owned by it. On the road home, we travelled together for many days. He spoke more of breakfasts missed and found than of dragons and kings, and somehow that balance made the whole journey feel truer. At last, we reached the place where the road to his green country turned aside. The air there was softer, edged with the smell of gardens and chimney smoke. We said farewell by a quiet bend in the lane, with no audience but the hedges. I thanked him, though no thanks could quite match what he had carried for us. He smiled, wished never again to sleep in a tree among spiders, and walked on toward the round door that had once seemed to him the whole world. I watched until he was only a small shape on the hill, and then turned back toward stone and duty. Now I speak from a hall where young dwarves lift hammers under the lonely mountain, and new songs rise that carry our journey into days I will not see. My beard has turned white, my step grown slow, but when the young ask me what mattered most, I do not first think of the dragon's hoard or the clash on the hillside. I think of a hobbit who stepped forward when he was afraid, of a hand that spared a pitiful creature in the dark, of a bright stone given up so that friends would not slaughter one another. Those are the treasures I handle most often in my thoughts. And if my words have reached you across time and page, I would ask you to let this story sit quietly beside your own for a while. Think of the knocks that have come at your door, of the chances to choose comfort or courage, holding on or letting go. Then keep wondering gently what you most hope to carry home when your own long road at last bends back toward the place you call your door.